Thanks everybody for having me. Just by way of process, I'm going to give you a little bit clearer idea of what I've been up to for the last 10 years of my life, but I also want to set the expectation before I begin delivering the content that I'll deliver that will have some conversation after I deliver sort of my thoughts and my experience. I think that's critically important that we're able to have some kind of dialogical process, because I've found that my experience is, although not unique in the Episcopal Church, is eccentric enough that sometimes there's not resonance or there's some confusion, or I've accidentally and with the best of intentions horribly offended my colleagues, and I don't intend that. So let me give you what I intend to give you around the sustainability of innovative church plants and broader speaking around that, and then we can break down some of the components of my ministry and my experience and how it might relate to your ministry and your experience, and how you lead and how you seek to support those people like me, or even people who are more creative. As Eric said, I am the convener of a community called FADS. What I would say from the get-go is it's not St. Thad's, it's not Thad's Place, it's just Thad's. It's named for Thaddeus, one of the 12, and we intentionally picked that name because there is no biblical account of what Thaddeus did. So we know that Thaddeus was a leader in the Jesus movement, but there's no account. There's a little bit of a legend that maybe he went to India with Thomas and died of malaria, which is sort of wonderful. I kind of like that idea that, like, you know, you did this really courageous thing and then ended up dying of diarrhea in India. But the idea was that, like, could we create a community of people who are significant leaders in the Jesus movement, who are real disciples of Jesus, but who aren't so ego involved that they would have to have stories written about them or be central figures in the biblical text. So that's where the name comes from. Where did the idea come from? There's a bit of a story here for the idea, and I'll say I grew up in Texas, in the Diocese of Texas, at a tiny little church in Houston called St. Martin's. And Bishop Payne, who was then the rector of St. Martin's, brought me into his office when I was a senior in high school, and he just planted a seed. He said, "Hey, here's the deal, Jimmy. Yeah, you could go to law school or you could go to business school, but there are a couple people around here who think you might consider seminary." And my first response to him as an arrogant, 17-year-old kid was like, "Well, I don't want to go to seminary because I don't want to be poor." To which Bishop Payne responded, "Do I look like I'm missing any meals at St. Martin's?" Which I responded, "Touche." And then he just said, like, "Keep it in mind." And I said, "What do I have to do to make myself a suitable candidate?" I was moving from an area prep school to the University of Texas, and he said, "I would just like you to make pretty decent grades at an undergrad and find a church," which I did. So fast forward, I went back to St. Martin's. I served as a youth minister there. Then I went on to Virginia Seminary, and after Virginia Seminary, Bishop Payne placed me at the Episcopal Student Center on the edge of the campus of the University of Texas. And what he said to me when he gave me that job and gave me that calling is, he said, "Jimmy, you are either going to be a good campus minister at the University of Texas, or you're going to be the last." Because we spend about $85,000 a year keeping this ministry afloat. And, we're getting about 5 kids. And that just doesn't make sense. And that rang my bell in 2 ways. The first way it rang my bell was like, there was no way I was going to disappoint Bishop Payne. He was too central of a figure in my life, and so I was going to work hard for him. And then the second part was just like, I already had, and I think he recognized a bit of an entrepreneurial zeal or a missional zeal about me. So the challenge of rebuilding a ministry from the ground up was really appealing to me right out of seminary. And frankly, the stakes were a little lower than they would have been if he had stuck me in a parish with, say, 25 or 40 people, because, you know, of the cycle of campus ministry. John and I were talking earlier at breakfast this morning that it's really about 2.5 years. You know, it takes kids a while to get there, and then once they're on their way out, they're kind of on their way out. And you don't have the same timeline that you have in a parish. So it was an opportunity to rebuild. It was an opportunity to learn how to run a small business. We did a bit of a capital campaign and a remodel on a very small scale in the student center. It was a great, great experience. And about 1.5 years into my tenure there was a regional gathering of bishops, and Bishop Payne had been intentionally sending younger clergy to Austin to see if we might collaborate. And he said, look, I want all of you young clergy to come and talk to this group of bishops, and I want you to respond to one question, and that is, if you could do anything to attract your demographic of people to church, what would you do? And I was like, that's a great question. I thought about it, I prayed about it, I thought about it some more. And at the time, I don't know if you know Austin or not, but Austin has a very active live music scene, and on 6th Street, and now that's developed further south. And but at the time, 4th Street was just a bunch of pretty much abandoned railroad warehouses. And so when I prayed, I had this very clear vision of like, you know, I'd go down there to 4th Street, I would get one of those warehouses, and I would put a neon cross up on top of it that says Jesus loves rather than Jesus saves. And we're a live music city, so I would have like really funky, good, like authored, self-authored live music and lively preaching and teaching and lively interaction with different kinds of people. And still today, which this was, you know, 16 years ago, I can see that place so clearly in my mind. Fast forward 16 years, I'm doing that. And I have been doing it for 10 years. It's just in a different place with different people in a slightly different way. That's what Fads is. It's that warehouse church. So what we were really looking for when we set out to create the community that is Fads is, how could we create a church within the Diocese of Los Angeles that would attract people who wouldn't otherwise darken the door of one of our traditional churches? Does that make sense? So what I mean to say to us as Episcopalians, pedigreed Episcopalians, is that people who love the liturgy and love the tradition and love the institution of the church, what I mean to say is that there's a whole group of people out there, the vast majority of people out there, who are never going to come to what we do. It's not their preference. It's not to their taste. It's not to their style. It's not about signage or marketing or formation. It's just not the way they roll. So instead of creating a funnel or a front porch that might load, bring people onto the front porch and then load them into the church, our idea was to create a community that would just be different. So there's a bit of a history to that within the Anglican tradition of creating communities that are founded and planted that seek to reach a specific demographic of people. And the phrase that we have for those in the Episcopal Church is minster. So most minsters, like Westminster Abbey, were created to serve, most minsters are created to serve academic communities. They were never meant to be parish churches, they were just meant to serve academic communities. So if you need to place fads historically in an Anglican timeline, call us a minster, but call us a minster that is meant to serve a community of people who would never otherwise darken the door of a traditional church. That's just a little background. Over the course of the last decade in talking about my work at Fads and what I've done, I've learned that just having like a practical or logistical conversation about what we do on Sunday or what we do Monday through Saturday doesn't really work. It's a little bit like, those of us who are Episcopalians who went and visited Willow Creek in the 90s, like we might have gone and we might have learned a lot from that experience, but it was very challenging to translate that into our present reality. So I'd rather have a theological conversation that moves to an ecclesiological conversation that might move to nuts and bolts down the line. Does that kind of trajectory make sense? So I'll give you another slide here just to start out with a little piece from Romans. And this is, I intentionally grabbed the Message translation just because it upsets the apple cart for us in kind of a wonderful way and helps us read a little bit differently. But it says, what we've learned is this is from the 3rd chapter. God does not respond to what we do, we respond to what God does. We finally figured it out. Our lives get in step with God and all others by letting Him set the pace, not by proudly or anxiously trying to run the parade. So I wonder if we can make ourselves vulnerable enough to admit that we have been in the church, especially over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades, proudly and anxiously trying to run the parade. Do we have some sense of that we've been a bit cart before the horse? And let me be absolutely clear on this. I think most of the missteps that we've made as a church, or most of the missteps that we make as followers of Jesus, or most of the missteps that we make as Christian people, are accidentally and with the best of intentions. So when I think critically about the church, I don't mean to be a critic, I just mean to be a critical thinker. And there's no shame in admitting or affirming that we have been trying to proudly and anxiously run the parade. What it is just an acceptance that we simply join a long line of human beings who have done just the same, at least for 2,000 years, right? Because this guy is writing 2,000 years ago, and no doubt we will have that in the future, but nevertheless, we try to improve upon the past. And so that's where we sit when we come to a conference like this. We come to connect one to another, but also to take some tidbits back that might help us improve in the work that we are doing, not so that we become more competent institutional functionaries, but so that we can join the kingdom. Jesus is so clear when he says the kingdom of heaven is now. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven has come near to you. And this is something that I believe that as we invest ourselves into the work of the church, that we join that work, that kingdom work here on earth. So if we can take our cue from this passage of Romans and we can affiliate ourselves with the God of the Bible, the question that I would ask us, and this is a theological question, is could we agree that God is active, creative, engaged in the world in which we live, that the Spirit is at work in the world, both in the world of the church and in the world outside the church? Could we agree that the Spirit is innovating outside of the boundaries or functions or vision or mission of the church in order to carry forward this reality, and again to use the Peterson translation of those words, that we are children, that every human being is a child, chosen and marked by God's love, the delight of God's life? Could we argue that we have a branch of the Jesus movement that is called the Episcopal Church, but that there is certainly a branch of the Jesus movement that is guided by the Spirit, that is not church at all, at least as we recognize it? Can we move our thinking in that direction and say, like, indeed, the Spirit is perfectly comfortable at a hotel or a school or a restaurant or elsewhere? And if you agree with me that the Spirit is at work in the world, innovating and creating for our good, then what commentary would we make around the world's innovation and our own? So I'm going to show you a series of slides here, and they'll sort of be a yesteryear image and a today year image for a variety of things that I just want you to look at. This is a hospital, then and now. This is a living room, then and now. This is a classroom, then and now. This is a gym, then and now. This is a soldier, then and now. This is a yogi, and now. Do you know what the next image is? This is a church. And now. Is this someone's church? My assistant put this together. I'm not sure which Episcopal church it is, but it is an Episcopal church that she was able to find on the web. And it's funny, she's a millennial, a digital native, and she was like, yeah, that's so neat, that's like a 50s car there. And I was like, no, it's like a late 70s car, I think. And that's, and I don't know, the only difference is power lines. And I'm sure there was power one way or another before. So I just bring this to our attention in the sense of if the Spirit is innovating outside the world, would you say the Spirit is innovated in the classroom? Would you say the Spirit that technological innovation in hospitals is Spirit-led? Could you say that technological innovation in the realm of physical fitness is Spirit-led? Could you say that technological innovation in human performance around athletics is spiritually led? I think, we could. We would. And I think it could be indicting for us to look into our own living rooms and see where we still insist upon imposing a certain structure, a certain form and order around things because they are familiar to us, but that we might not be paying attention to the world in a way that would be theologically beneficial to us, even faithful as people who are moving in and around the world. So when this reality kind of came to me and came somewhat kind of crashing down on me the trajectory that I took in my work was to really become a student of innovation and to try to figure out where the world was innovating and to see if I could take my theological education and my knowledge of the biblical narrative and my, at the time, 10 plus years experience as a priest, and to see if I could discern the work of the Spirit in other places, and that I might be able to translate some of that innovative work and bring it into the context of the church. And this became my guiding principle here. So this is from the examination of the ordination of a priest in the Book of Common Prayer, and maybe you can read it or maybe you can't. It says, will you be diligent in the reading and study of the Holy Scriptures, and in seeking the knowledge of such things as they may make you a stronger and more able minister of Christ? And I was like, wow, like that's pretty broad. Like that thing that I affirmed, that promise that I affirmed is broad. It's way broader than reading the daily office. It's way broader than preparing a sermon on Sundays. It really means that I have not only committed to continue to be a student of the narrative of Scripture, but I have committed myself to be a student of how God is working in the world and wherever God might find God's self working in the world. And what I realized from my setting and from my context as an Episcopal priest is like that process of looking outside the church for training or knowledge or ideas or vision wasn't very popularly received. In fact, it wasn't an idea that had really even occurred to very many of us. Yet, it is an idea that occurred to the people who created the ordinal, right? I mean, these people were clearly plugged in to the reality that the narrative of Scripture needs to be alive, and that it is alive out in the world, and that there are supplements to Scripture and tradition that will help us exercise our ministry as missionaries in the world in an effective way. Does that make sense? You following me? I'm not losing you, not freaking you out yet? Good. So here are just some of the places that I've done that, and these are symbolic, and what I'd like to do is just sort of talk about my experience with these different areas a little bit, and then what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take us across the harbor just for a second, and then bring us back to the Episcopal Church. So I just put the Jim Collins cover up there, Good to Great. Maybe you've read it. If you haven't read it, you should probably read it. Like, it's a pretty good book. It's not a pretty good book, it's a great book. And it's got a lot of, research that's still important, but really what I mean that book to be is symbolic for like the massive amount of content that is out in the world to consume, to digest, to integrate, to translate to our context as leaders in the church or people who are supporting leaders in the church, to really immerse yourselves in that literature that is not theological or ecclesiological, but is maybe driven by psychology or business or finance or athletics or any other number of things, and then to use our theological training or our faith formation to translate that into a spiritual context to inform what we're doing today. Just like a little trick or a little hack for me in my life, the way I do that is audible.com. I mean, I'm in the car a lot. I live in LA, so, my 6-mile commute is about an hour. And I listen to books. I listened to a book all the way down from LA this morning, and I downloaded another one last night so that I'll have another one. And I probably listened to 6 or 7 books that have nothing to do with theology. Every once in a while, one of them may bump up against spirituality, but those are those books that you think like, oh man, like I really should read that book. And maybe you even buy that book, but you don't actually read it. It just kind of sits there. Like, here's the deal, like, I never would have read I'm Malala, but I listened to the story of Malala Yousafzai, like, it's an amazing story that has so much purchase in the kingdom. And that leaning into that kind of content, I think, is exceedingly important. I'm just kind of moving around the clock. There's a picture of Brene Brown. I've become, just a student and friend of Brene's. I think her work is so compelling. The power of vulnerability over and against. Power is made perfect in weakness. I mean, what Brene really is just a very effective translator of the gospel, especially as it's articulated by Paul in the New Testament. And her work on shame resilience and courage and resilience is absolutely phenomenal. So if you don't know her work, I would encourage you to take some time and make an investment in at least reading, her 3 most popular books. Really thinking a lot about this issue of sustainability and philanthropy, making a love-spreading difference in the world, giving. How do you do that? I've become a student of Tom's. Tom's? Tom's Shoes. Tom's is a shoe company that was started in the same year that Fads was, in 2006, by a really interesting guy named Blake Mycoskie. And what Blake did, Blake is a serial entrepreneur. Tom's is his 5th company. You don't really know that unless you become a student of Blake's, but he's a serial entrepreneur, and in a really busy time in his life, he took a little mini sabbatical down to Argentina, and his goal while he was in Argentina was to drink red wine, learn to dance the tango, and learn to play polo. So he was taking, a few months out of his life to do this. He was at an internet cafe, and who I'm sure was an evangelical Christian, came to him, like chatted him up. Blake's a total extrovert, and so he's like chatting this person up. He's like, hey, what are you doing down here? He's like, I'm playing polo and drinking wine and learning the tango. What are you doing down here? We're giving away shoes. So we gathered a bunch of used shoes, we put them all in a duffel bag, and we take them out to the countryside, and we give things away. And like a good evangelical Christian, what did she do? She invited him to come along, right? And so Blake goes out into the countryside the next day with this complete and total stranger, and he puts shoes on kids' feet all day long. He's in tears all day long. It changes his life. He comes back to the city, and he, touches base with his polo instructor, and he says, like, we got to figure out a way to do this. And there's a traditional shoe that, if you know, this shoe is modeled after a traditional Argentinian shoe called the Alpargata. It's a canvas moccasin that people in rural Argentina wear because it can get wet and dry very quickly. And so Blake hatches this idea of, like, So I could go back, and at this time he's amassed a pretty considerable amount of dough for a guy in his late 20s or early 30s. I think he was in his late 20s at the time. And he's like, so I could go raise a bunch of money for this, but eventually it's going to fade. Like that money, that interest is going to fade, like every philanthropic interest fades over time. So how could I create a model? So he and his polo instructor friend have about 100 pairs of these Alpargatas made, and he brings them back to Venice, California, and he invites all the like fashionable female friends, including his sister and his mom, to a dinner party. There are 12 people that he invites to a dinner party, and he puts the shoes, a pair of shoes, at every place setting. And they sit down and they have dinner, and they're like, what's the deal with the shoes, Blake? He tells his story and he says, here's the deal. Like, so for every pair of shoes that I sell here in Los Angeles, we're going to give one away in Argentina. And by the end of the night, those 12 are like stuffing cash in his pocket. To date, they've given over 50 million pairs of shoes. They are committed to they never give a pair of shoes to a kid that they don't feel relatively comfortable that they can give the next pair of shoes to. Does that make, you see what I'm saying? Like, kids grow out of shoes, so they don't just go around giving shoes willy-nilly. 50% of his business, and the hardest part of his business, has been the giveaway side of his business. And he's partnered with like 1 million organizations, including a bunch of Christian relief organizations, and has really become the leader of social entrepreneurship, at least in the United States. So I really looked at that model. Like, how can we do giving that, we sit in this capitalist culture? How can we sort of redeem rabid capitalism, capture some of that culture, but also make a love-spreading difference in the world at the same time? And then I've always been kind of outdoorsy, and so I took a sabbatical a couple years ago. I got one of those amazing Lilly grants, and the focus of my Lilly grant was to look at outdoors as sacred space and outdoor recreation as spiritual discipline. And it came directly out of my observation that I was regularly fly fishing or skiing or surfing or mountaineering with these people who were amazingly spiritually dialed people, really spiritually dialed people, but who would never darken the door of a church, and actually found it very confusing and confounding that we would be making our way to the top of the Grand Teton there, and that it would come out that I was a priest. What's a priest doing up here? Climbing a mountain like you are, Mike. Trying to, connect with the same thing that you're connecting with. So I've spent a lot of time with that. That kind of led me over to something that you heard Eric talk about a little bit in the introduction that he gave. But I have, for the last about 4 or 5 years, worked with Red Bull High Performance. So, Red Bull, the energy drink, it gives you wings. It doesn't really give you wings. They got sued for that. They had to pay everyone $2, which is kind of awesome. So Red Bull has 2 marketing campaigns. Their one marketing campaign is Red Bull gives you wings, and that failed. Their other marketing campaign is that they just slap a Red Bull cap or toque or sticker on every X game athlete that they can, while that athlete is either performing their athletic endeavor or talking to the camera. That has been their marketing strategy over the time. And so in order to continue that strategy, they built out this department around athletic performance. And there's a guy named Andy Walsh, who was the former coach of the U.S. Olympic ski team that Red Bull lured away, and Andy has set up this really amazing coaching facility with the financial resources of Red Bull, and included in his vision for human performance or athletic performance was a cog on his wheel that he called spirituality. And I have a parishioner in my congregation who works at Red Bull and works in Andy's division, and he said, hey, came up to me one Sunday and was like, hey Jimmy, I think you ought to come over and talk to Red Bull. I was like, I don't even drink caffeine, like, let alone Red Bull. Like, I've never had a Red Bull. I was like, no, I don't do that. And he's like, yeah, but you surf and ski. And I was like, yeah, but I ski blue slopes and I surf little waves. Like, I'm not that. He's like, no, come over and talk to these guys. And that conversation, being open to that conversation, has led me into some of the most fantastic, like, evangelistic missional opportunities that I've ever had. Like, really talking to people about spiritual formation and mission and the presence of God in their lives. And that sort of the pinnacle of that experience was leading or co-leading a trip to Patagonia, to southern Chile, where we took 4 Red Bull athletes along with 2 former Navy SEALs and moi on like a 14-day journey through the glacial wilderness of Patagonia. And when I got brought into the project, I came into a room that was similar to this, and there was a prezi, and it said HFU. And it was like, hey, do you want to come work with some Navy SEALs? And I was like, I don't think so. Like, I'm like a pacifist, basically, or sort of. Like, I might be a pacifist, I might not, you know, when it comes to my kids, or, you know, I don't know. Like, so I came into this room, and there's a Navy SEAL, and Andy, and another woman who works for Red Bull High Performance. And I was like, what's HFU? And they know I'm a priest, and they're a little uncomfortable with the fact that I'm a priest, and they're like, well, what's the name of the trip? I was like, well, what does it stand for? And they all kind of looked down, sheepish, and then Anna, this woman, says, like, it stands for harden the F up. And I was like, okay. And they're like, what do you think about that? And I said, well, I mean, I get it. Like, I get that, like, that works for people, but shame and spirituality can't coexist. And so if your intention is to really truly have a spiritual component to this project, you're going to have to rename it. And they're like, okay, you rename it. I was like, oh, come on, guys. Like, I haven't even signed on to this project. So we ended up running Project Acheron. Does anyone know what Acheron is? Do you remember? Acheron is the river in Dante's poem where the damned on the banks of the river are those who are neither good enough to get into heaven nor bad enough to get into hell. So the idea was that we were going to push these guys through an experience where they would be one or the other. And sure enough, it was an incredibly fruitful experience that led to some additional work with naval special warfare. So I have spent a little time in this city, just across the water here. There sits a base where some of these guys are trained. And to bring it back around, back to sort of our work and where we might find some resonance and some hope. I spent a couple days across the water at the SEAL base, and I got to look inside all the, like, incredible training that they do there, all the BUDS training, the sort of initiation into the SEAL community, and then some of the SQT stuff, the SEAL qualification training. And, like, so for me, like, as like a dude and kind of like a dudeish dude, like, that was like, I was kind of nerded out by all that stuff. Like, oh my God, that's so cool. Look at these guns and look at these, like, crazy athletic things that are training. You know, you have guys in, like, big masks on like treadmills. Like, what are they doing? They're training at sea level to fly to Afghanistan, to be deployed. I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like amazingly cool, nerdy stuff. How does that apply? How do you translate that to church, to being a priest? Here's what I walked away with. I was like, after spending like 2 days with these guys and really listening to what they said, here's what dawned on me. Arguably, the most elite fighting force in the history of fighting forces, right? We could say that about the SEALs. Maybe there are 2 or 3 other detachments historically that might come up against them, but they're tied for first then. Let's just say they're tied for first historically. In the initiation period, in the discernment period to see if you have what it takes to be a disciple of the Navy SEALs, if you have what it takes to get into the club, they use 3 tools. Only 3. You know what they are? Here's one of them. An obstacle course. It's not a fancy one. It's not a fancy one at all. It's like old wooden logs and kind of broken down ropes and nets, and you jump over things and climb up over things and crawl under things, and you run and you push yourself physically. So they use an obstacle course, and they use 2 other things. You know what those 2 other things are?
Swimming pool? Swimming pool?
Well, kind of. Water. And one more. Sand. Basically, an obstacle course, water, and sand. But they have such a sense of how to use these tools effectively and precisely. So what you might not know about SEALs is they have 2 groups of SEALs that come through. They have summer and winter SEALs, right? So if you're a winter SEAL, like, bummer, right? Do you know how much colder this water is? This water is probably 12 degrees colder in the winter than it is in the summer. And 12 degrees is a lot for water, right? So I was like, asking these guys, I was like, how do you do that? Like, how do you, is there a pecking order within the SEALs? Like, yeah, you're a SEAL, but you're a summer SEAL. There's not, because it's all timed. So they would say, here's the deal, Jimmy. Everyone's just as miserable in the summer as they are in the winter. They just spend a little bit more time in water. So everyone's just as cold, but it's just all about timing. And I was like, wow, as an Episcopal priest, we kind of have 3 things. We have the Bible, we have the prayer book, and we have the sacraments. Those are our tools that we have to use. But do we have such command of those things that we can effectively use them to deploy, arguably, tied for first, the most effective disciples in the history of disciple making? I promised that I would talk to you a bit about sustainability, and I want to do that, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to have a conversation afterwards too. I have opinions about sustainability in church that are strongly held, and those extend especially to creative or emergent or eccentric church plants. But just this definition of sustainable, able to be maintained at a certain rate or level, able to be upheld or defended. Probably if we're in this room, we all have some sense that that model that we inherited, whether it was from the 20s or from the 50s, of 5 acres, 100 people, and 1 priest, sustainable or not sustainable today? What would you say?
Not sustainable.
Not. Probably not. Like, it's still working in some places, and it probably could for a while, but, you know, we're probably looking at different models, whether it's scaling up and all the problems of staffing up around that, or whether it's reducing, you know, reallocating the assets of our existing dioceses or churches in order to deploy them in other places like businesses do from time to time when they're being missional or strategic, you know. But here's what I would say about church plants, and there's one qualification that I will make. The exception to the rule, I'll state before the rule, is the exception is that in historically oppressed, distressed, or under-resourced communities, this rule does not stand. But I believe, as an Episcopal priest, as a member of the institution, as a person who takes his seat in the councils of the church, and as a person who has been on the entrepreneurial or missional side of the church, I believe that anything that we start new, unless they fall into the category of the exception, I believe that they should be financially self-sustaining from the get-go. What do I mean by that? So just to, when people ask me, like, what are you most proud of about your work over the course of the last 10 years, when I'm in circles like this, one of the things that, the thing that I'm most proud of is something that is least known about Fads. Fads has been financially self-sustaining since day one. We took $20,000 from the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles in our first year on a $330,000 annual budget. That was in 2006. We went through, we started a church arguably at the worst time. I guess we could have started in 2007 and it would have been like a little worse. We started at the worst time, and we have always been financially self-sustaining. And we always will be, or we'll shutter Fads. We'll shutter our ministry and redeploy the assets of the ministry elsewhere. Now, how does that relate back to this topic of innovation? Could we be faithful enough to make the argument, if I draw your attention back to this then and now pictures, could we be faithful enough to say that innovation and sustainability are tied one to another, that they're connected? That if you want to create sustainable communities within the context of your diocese, or if you want to make your church sustainable over time, is it important that part of the DNA of that community or that institution or that congregation or that ministry that you build is financially it is innovative? You know, that innovation is just an expectation of what would always happen, that there would always be innovative iterations in the life of that community. You know, I think you could. I think we should. I will say that what I have heard from any number of, you know, I put in quotations, young seminarians, I'd say as an Episcopalian, I come into rooms like this and people say, like, it's so nice to have a young person in the room. Like, I'm 45 and I've been ordained for 17 years. And I get that oftentimes I'm younger than a lot of people in the room, but I'm like solidly middle-aged, right? I'll be lucky to live to 90. So when I interact with younger seminarians, what a lot of people say is like, man, Jimmy, what you're doing is so interesting and so inspiring, and I would love to do what you're doing, but, do you know what the qualifier is?
I'm too old.
My bishop won't give me any money. When I hear that, you know what I do? In my mind, I automatically disqualify that person for starting up a new, innovative ministry. Like, you've got to be able to think through that issue, because this is hard work. This is really mind-boggling hard work to do in this day and age, especially in a place like West Los Angeles. But to go back to one of those learnings that I learned outside the context of theology and scripture and traditional seminary formation. One of the reasons why I put the book up there on the cover. In Colin's Good to Great, his sort of sage advice is start with who, not what. And that's a mistake that we make all the time in the Episcopal Church, where we're like, what's the model? Hey, Jimmy, can you fly over here and spend a couple days with us and give us the FADS model? I'm like, no. There's no model. And fair enough to make the observation that when we establish communities around identities, that we run the risk of creating personality cults, right? We do that. I mean, that's it. You put a charismatic leader up in front of folks who is appropriately ambitious and ego-driven, but mature and wise. You still run that risk. We run that risk. But to say that we don't run that risk in our traditional congregations too, I think is a little like intellectually dishonest. So let's reach for those dynamic leaders in my mind. Let's really focus on that rather than try to create a formula that probably won't apply. So secondarily, what am I most pleased about at FADS is we're 10 years old in September, and we've sent 6 people to seminary. 6 people have been ordained. We have another one in process right now, which I think is just like absolutely phenomenal. At the ordination in the Diocese of Los Angeles, one of the canons of the cathedral, we have, this is a little funny, but we have codeines that are, seriously, that's their title, codeines. I was like, really, guys? Like, something else, but we do have codeines. One of the codeines came up to me and he's like, Jimmy, man, it seems like every single time we're having an ordination here, someone from FADS is being ordained. And I was like, I know, Mark, like, don't think it's an accident. It's a slow, non-hostile takeover. Like, we're really going to try to make a run at this thing. Every single one of those 6 are in traditional settings. Every single one of them. And it disappoints me a teeny bit. But, I'm glad that like the traditional church is capturing the energy and innovation from those folks. I think the 7th will not enter a traditional church. So I'm gonna stop there, and we can just use the rest of our time for conversation. You can ask any questions that you might have, or give me any thoughts, or throw some hardballs if you want to throw hardballs, or whatever makes sense. Yeah.
Just from a practical perspective, could you talk about the financial sustainability? I mean, so you started with $20,000 from the diocese. Where did you get the rest of the money?
What I call spiritual venture capital. So like I basically went out and just like raised money from wealthy people, and I'm a little shameless in asking people for support, but that's kind of just part of the gig, right? I mean, in the church these days, you have to be willing to be passionate enough about what you do to ask people for their financial resources to support it. What I've really been going back and forth with now is around spiritual formation and the raising of those funds. Like, have we been fundraising at FADS, or have we been forming people in giving, in living into the generosity that I see expressed in the gospel? And I can't can't really tell you whether we've done one or the other. You know, I think my inclination, I heard Richard Rohr said something that really stuck with me a few days ago. And he said, so now neuroscience has said that in order for you to connect with generosity, you have to spend 15 seconds with it. So anything less than 15 seconds, like your brain doesn't really register generosity, it registers scarcity, like it registers outflow. And when he said that, what I immediately thought of is how many like wonderfully generous, wealthy people have over the last 10 years, or really 11 years that I've been raising money for Thad's, like reached into their pocket and quietly slipped a check because they wanted some anonymity around the size of their gift to our community. And I like responded with that, thank you very much, and like brought it and then took it to our bookkeeper kind of on the DL rather than sticking it in the basket and letting other people see that there was a $20,000 check or something. I was like, I think I've made a mistake there. You know, what do I need to do? I probably need to say like, hey, Peter, thank you. Let me tell you what this is going to do for us in our community. Let me just take 17 seconds of your time and tell you what this is going to do for our community. Yeah, John.
So I like the thought of that it's not the what, it's the who, and your TEDx talk on you gave one on courage, and whatever kind of sustainability and innovation looks like in the church, I know that it's going to require courage. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit, and specifically, you know, I know as a diocesan staff member, the way that you infuse courage into an organization is not calling everyone together to give a talk on courage or to teach 7 points to being courageous. I know that it's practicing courage, and that courage is something that spreads. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on what courage looks like in ministry, how it spreads to an organization, what we as diocesan leaders can do to just to be part of that movement of courage spreading throughout the church.
Sure, that's a great question, and one that's of interest to me. And so off the top of my head, what I would say to that is courage is a cardinal virtue. It has a balancing virtue in theology of prudence. Like, so we're not asking for people to be rash, but we're asking them to take some measured risk. I mean, Aquinas calls it fortitude, but let's just call it courage because that's what we call it nowadays. So is there, we already have some sense from the church that the well-formed Christian will have some practice of courage in his or her life. The question is, how do we articulate that within the context of our work, a diocese, a church, a school? You know, what does that look like? Well, it probably looks like a lost practice in the Episcopal Church, one that we didn't pick up, or an area of atrophy, one that for the sake of using the old-fashioned term, I'll use it anyway, and then you can imagine it to be whatever it is. It's testimony. Like, you have to have people who are willing to make themselves vulnerable enough to tell their stories in front of other people. And so I have a practice around that, you know, in my own life, in my own preaching or my own teaching, is that I'm pretty shy about telling you about my wins. But I'll tell you about my losses all day long. And I will, because I know that's going to foster connection. That vulnerability, that failure is going to foster connection between us. And that connection is going to provide us with a little bit of energy to get back up, to practice resilience, and to get back out there and risk something the next day. So, you know, I think you can't bring people forward at a clergy conference or a diocesan convention and to talk about what a fantastic job they've done, because that will turn people off instantly. I mean, I don't think you will actually accomplish fostering courage, but you'll probably just get a lot of people who are tuned out. So what I would do is, you know, for the lack of a better word, just have some kind of like failure fest or something, and have that become something that is encouraging to people. What does that look like outside of the church? It is incarnational outside the church in a very functional way in modern American spirituality. What does it look like? It looks like this. Hi, my name is Bill W., and I am an alcoholic. How freaking courageous is that? Like, that is so marvelously courageous. It gives me goosebumps to like think about people having that kind of courage. You know, so that's vulnerability, failure. It's also testimony, but it's testimony just in the right way.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Yeah, you used the word early on when, I think in the story about Bishop Payne, that he recognized you had an entrepreneurial or missional zeal. And missional is the word we throw around a lot, right? And we talk about the church needs to be more missional, or the churches that are going to be 21st century churches are missional. And I wonder what that means in the context of fads, what you would mean by missional. I get the entrepreneurial part.
Yeah.
But what are we really talking about there?
I think for me, it's like, it's that Monday through Saturday followers of Jesus point. Like, are we creating Monday through Saturday followers of Jesus, or are we creating Sunday followers of Jesus? And just to flip that around. And that kind of came out of my experience of, you know, I went from the University of Texas to All Saints Beverly Hills, you know, like another like corporate, multi-staff, resource-sized congregation. And after a couple years there, I looked up from that like really high-functioning church, at least reputationally and programmatically high-functioning church, and I was like, man, like you could do everything that we asked of you. You could come to church almost every Sunday. You could give of your financial resources to a percentage. You could take all of the classes that we deliver in Alpha Beta Covenant. You could join a small group. You could be a part of some kind of external mission or ministry off-site of the church. You could do all of those things and still be like a total jerk. And I was like, if that's true, something's a little wrong here. Like, we didn't have the church. When I joined the staff at All Saints Beverly Hills, they didn't have the expectation that from the day that I started my job there to the day that I ended my job there, that during that period of time, I would have become a better husband. Like, nobody ever said that. Nobody ever said, like, because of your affiliation with our community, we expect that you'll be an improved coworker. Like, you'll be able to more effectively and with spiritual maturity interact with your coworkers. You know, there wasn't that expectation. There was an expectation of change, like some kind of change would exist, but there was no expectation that there would be like qualitative improvement in my life. So when I think about missional, I think about it in my own congregation in those terms. Like, is Jimmy a better husband? Because from the day that he started Thad's until the day that he got hit by the bus or eaten by the shark, or, you know, like hopefully I am. I also think just getting off the cloister. Like, if you run every meeting at the diocesan center or every meeting at the church because that's what you've always done or because that's what's convenient, you're robbing yourself of interacting with the world. And you're just shutting yourself down and closing yourself in. And it's accidentally and with the best of intentions. Everybody knows how to drive to church. Everybody, you know, nobody feels weird about reading the Bible in church, but they might feel weird about reading it at Chili's. You know, like, well, maybe it's a good idea for us to feel a little bit weird about reading it in Chili's. Or maybe it's a good idea that we read the Bible in Chili's and then we're like, oh my God, we just tipped 7%. Like, we can't do that. We can't do that here. You know, so I think getting off site and out of our comfort zone really has a big impact, and that's what missional kind of means to me.
I know that most of us seek for cookie cutter models because that absolves us of the responsibility of figuring things out. But I'd like to ask a slightly different question, I hope.
Sure.
And it's sort of informed by my personal interest in Ignatian spirituality that teaches us to be open to letting God find us rather than to seeking God. So my question is, how do we open ourselves up to be found by this entrepreneurial spirit?
Interact with people who are different than you. People that you can't predict. People that you don't have, that your intuition doesn't immediately ring on. People that make you somewhat uncomfortable. People who don't look like you. People who have a different family background. I mean, that's just totally off the top of my head. Like, and that's a little bit of that get out mentality, but we can't just keep driving from church to the club and from the club to the house and from the house to the school. It just doesn't work anymore. It's just, I wish it worked. It would be so much easier. I don't really wish it would work. It would be boring. But for me. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question as best I can? Yeah.
One of the things I remember about Bishop Claude Payne was his take on the diocese as being the basic unit of the church, the indivisible unit, so to speak, of the church. Being that he was such a part of your formation, and with the experience that you've had since then, what do you think of what he was thinking at that time about the role of the diocese as being the church's basic unit?
I mean, I'm an Episcopal priest, so that makes sense to me. I've also been an Episcopal priest who has been afforded the luxury of serving 2 parishes that were in that way that large Episcopal parishes can be, dioceses unto themselves. Nodding, you know what I mean. So, and I've been on the church planting side of things for a decade. So, and I've been in campus ministry, so I have this like kind of funny resume, but I like the model. You know, I think it makes sense until it doesn't make sense anymore. But, you know, and I think it still makes sense. I mean, we know that real presence is important even in a virtual world, and we know that geography binds real presence. So I like the idea of being organized under a diocese and under the authority of a bishop. That makes sense to me. I mean, it may just be because that's what I'm used to. Now, what I would say is I want to be in a healthy diocese, a healthy bishop. And I've been incredibly well supported by my bishop. So my bishop gave me 20 grand, but he gave me $10 billion worth of cover and permission and encouragement. And I probably should have led with that, but I'm not sure it would have landed in the same way had I led with it. So when I started Fads, or when I intended to start Fads and the word got out, I did those like percept studies, you know, like, yeah, you guys probably know about that stuff because you work at Diocese or whatever. So like, I did it and I was like, wow, like in this 5-mile circle, 900,000 people live here in West Los Angeles. It's like, that's an awful lot of people. So then I went back to our diocesan reporting and I was like, So how many people of that 900,000 are going to the Episcopal Church on Sunday morning? Make a guess. 3K. So 3K rounded up, rounded way up. 3K, I rounded 3K up from what the rector's already rounded up. Does that make sense? So it's rounded up and then rounded up again. So when I made my presentation to my colleagues in that 5-mile radius and a little bit beyond, and I made my rational appeal to them, and I said, there are 900,000 people that live in this circle, and we only get 3,000 in the Episcopal Church on a Sunday morning. Isn't there room for one more congregation? They responded, no. And here's the deal. Here's the mistake that I made. Here's the mistake that I made. I made a rational argument in an emotional context. And it took me about 6 years to figure that out. I was like, why does this make sense to people? Like, what's going on? And like Myers-Briggs, I'm a weird priest. I'm like an INTP. So I'm like a strategist and a thinker, and I want to close the door, and like, you know, and I was like, oh, I should ask Cindy. I should ask my wife. We should have run this by her. She would have given me some insight into that. She's an ESFJ. She completes me. We were 24 when we got married. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
What is something that you thought would be easy and turned out to be way more difficult than you would have imagined?
God, what a great question. Something that I thought would be easy. I thought it would always be easy to not own a building. I thought that there would, that could just be a part of our DNA. That we at Fads, we live in a tent. And resisting bricks and mortar has been the hardest thing that I've had to do for the last 3 years. It's the hardest part of my job. Bless you. Yeah.
So knowing at least a little something about innovation loops, I'm aware that failure is an important part of innovation. It's also an important part of sustainability, taking cycles of death and things like that. How do you identify things that need to die? And how do you deal with the failures as part of your innovation?
Every time that we're conscious about a failure, we try to ritualize the death in some way. So we try to honor that in some way, whether it's like writing a note or getting a group of people together to have like a mini funeral, or going on a hike and standing up on top of the mountain with a group of 3 or 4 people who tried to do it and sort of say like, well, we gave it a shot. So I would say acknowledging the failure is important, and ritualistically acknowledging it is important. And then I guess there are just other ways that we've just like, failure is just such a normal part of what we do that there are some things that we've, now that you ask me the question, where I'm like, we're just like failing all the time. And so there's some gallows humor that's in the DNA of our community, where we're just like, oh my God, that was a disaster. Like some things we do that would go off so well, and other things we do like don't go off well at all. Like we do this, we do a like a Lenten sort of project every year that is tied to a novelty. So it's sort of like something that's funny, but also meant to like spur your thinking. So like one year we gave away luggage tags on the first Sunday of Lent, and it had our Thad's logo on one side, and it said on the other side, in the kingdom of heaven, your bags fly for free. Like your baggage flies for free. And we spent a lot of time with that. Another year we gave people pillowcases, and they had the Thad's logo on it and just said, here I am, here I am, here I am. And we were talking about rest-taking and Sabbath. And what I totally didn't realize was that the church barged into the place where humanity first has sex and second worries. Like, and I like way underestimated the gravity of that. And then last year, you know, I'm like always trying to get people out, like get out, go out and see the world. So last year, this is the failure story. The pillowcase was a bit of a failure in a good way, but last year we did, our theme for Lent was pilgrims, like Thad's pilgrims. And if you've ever been to Los Angeles and you've driven around and done kind of a tourist thing, you know that you can like pull off the side of the road and buy a star map. You know what I'm talking about? So like there'll be a map and it'll be like Brad Pitt lives here, drive to Brad Pitt's house, and people like drive by and they're like, there's the gate, there's the hedge, there's the other gate, there's the other hedge. You know, that's like a thing. And so we made a star map for Thad's, and we gave people a star map and some postcards, but the stars were like our Laundry Love Washateria, and like a really beautiful beach, and people assisting the homeless, and the cathedral center and stuff like that. And I got on and did this like cheesy video where I had like a cowboy hat on, like, and we did like a John Wayne montage where he was like, howdy pilgrim, 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 pilgrim. I was like, howdy Thad, pilgrims. You know, that was a total, it didn't work. It worked. Like, it just, people didn't do it. But good enough. This year we did the bird, like boundary drawing, like Jesus says, get thee behind me. At Thad's, we say to those things that are keeping you from living into your belovedness, into the kingdom, give them the bird. And we gave everyone a bird. It's right here. It's a little tiny little plastic bird. And then each week they got a little playing card that had a theme around the bird where it was like, the nest. Like, spend some time this week, you know, making sure that you have a space where you can really be in touch with your belovedness. Or the chirp. We were like, put the chirp behind you. What's the chirp? It's that like, you know, after Jesus preaches the sermon of his life, there's the guy from the back row who goes like, hey, Bob, like, isn't that Joseph's son? Like, don't do that. Don't do that, or don't surround yourselves with people like that, you know? Give it the bird, which is pushing it a little bit, but, you know, translated. Yeah, what's up?
So, what are the people at Thad's dreaming about, thinking about, and hoping for in the future?
They're dreaming about becoming big movie stars. You know, that's one of the great, you know, the courage question is such a good question, because one of the benefits of doing something creative in a place like Los Angeles is that there's already a culture of risk there. You know, it's not Cincinnati. You know, people don't move to Cincinnati with a pickup truck and a dream of like making it big in Cincinnati, but they do in Los Angeles. And what that gives us is a culture of risk, and then it gives us the shadow side of that, which is a culture of melancholy and disappointment and rejection. So I would say people are dreaming of the same things that all of humanity is dreaming of, like being connected, being affirmed, being well cared for, having a real sense of their belovedness, and being able to capture that belovedness or recapture it, be resilient around it when it fades, or when it becomes ephemeral, or when it is snatched away by trauma or tragedy. I know that's a broader answer, but I think that's a more honest one.